What's going on, Bottom Line viewers? It's Mitch here of the Bottom Line View, back with another NFL Stardom and Situm for your fantasy football team. Here in week number 10 of the 2017 NFL season, I'm going to give you 5 starts for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position, as well as 5 sits for each one of those positions. If you guys have never, ever visited the Bottom Line View before, this is an NFL channel where we cover fantasy football each game every week, giving you previews, predictions, and also game recaps of primetime Thursday night, Sunday night, and Monday night football. Let's get into the video. And of course, as always, I don't give you any obvious starts or sits. I give you the tough ones. That's why I'm here. Start off with the quarterback position. Jared Goff versus the Houston Texans. The Texans are allowing an average of 23 fantasy points to quarterbacks for the season. The Texans' defense just straight up isn't good. Since they lost J.J. Watt, Whitney Merciless, the pass rush hasn't been there, and their secondary is one of the worst in the NFL. Jared Goff on an absolute tear, putting up his best game ever against the Giants. Let's ride that wave into this week. Start Jared Goff against the Texans. Matt Stafford versus the Cleveland Browns. Speaking about Jared Goff, had his best game of the season and his best game of his career. Matt Stafford had an impressive game of his own last week against the Green Bay Packers in Green Bay, a place that he's never won before. He wins that game, puts up a great game. Now he's playing the Cleveland Browns. I say you start Matt Stafford. 5 times this season, an opposing quarterback has scored at least 20 fantasy points against Cleveland. I expect Matt Stafford to do that this week. Ben Roethlisberger versus the Colts. He's scored at least 20 fantasy points in each of his past 3 games coming off a bye week. The Steelers are usually well prepared. They usually have a good performance after the bye week. And hey, a Colts defense that isn't very good doesn't help either. I expect Antonio Brown to have a huge day. Vontae Davis was just released from the Colts, giving this secondary that was already bad even worse players to work with. Andy Dalton versus the Tennessee Titans. The Titans are allowing an average of 19.5 fantasy points a game to opposing quarterbacks. Titans secondary isn't very good. They're amongst the bottom 12 in the NFL against the pass, and there's really nobody that can cover A.J. Green on this team. Not like Jacksonville. Every single time that Andy Dalton has had a good matchup to work with, he's put up good fantasy points. This is another matchup-dependent player that you start against bad defenses. Josh McCown versus Tampa Bay. McCown comes into this game with at least 17 fantasy points in 5 games in a row. He's been one of the really good quarterbacks this year. He's playing his old team. He has a lot to prove. And I say that the Jets are going to win this one. And I think it should be a higher scoring game. So I expect McCown to having to throw a lot and throw a lot of touchdowns and yards. My quarterback sits this week. I have Phillip Rivers versus the Jaguars. Pretty much insert quarterback versus Jaguars here. Jacksonville is allowing only 7.5 fantasy points a game on average. I just don't see them getting it done against the best pass defense and the best defense in the league, coupled with a great pass rush and great corners. Jacoby Brissett versus Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's second versus the pass in 2017, although they're not nearly as good as Jacksonville. Jacoby Brissett has been like Andy Dalton, dependent on the matchup. Last week I told you to start him. Was a good matchup against Houston. This week, against a Pittsburgh team that's coming off a bye, well-rested, and had the tape and the time to study Jacoby, I think this is a sit for Jacoby this week. Jay Cutler versus Carolina. Don't be fooled by a great game by Jay Cutler last week. You know, he was pretty good last week, but this week he plays the Panthers, who have given up the least amount of yards in the NFL. Kirk Cousins versus Minnesota. The Vikings have allowed just one quarterback to score 20 fantasy points this season. They're one of the top 3 defenses in the NFL. Kirk Cousins doesn't have a ton to work with in terms of weapons offensively. Yes, he's a great quarterback in real life, but in fantasy, he hasn't been so great in the last couple of games. I expect that to stay the same way this week against the Vikings. Marcus Mariota versus Cincinnati. The Bengals rank 5th against the pass this year. They're very underrated in that regard, and Marcus Mariota hasn't really lit the world on fire in the passing game. So I expect Cincinnati to kind of shut down those receivers on the outside and force the Titans to beat them running the football. My running back starts this week. I have Carlos Hyde versus the New York Giants. The Giants have allowed an average of 103.6 rushing yards with 6 touchdowns to running backs on the road this season. The Giants seem like a team that has given up. Carlos Hyde in a game that the San Francisco 49ers should be close, this should be a good matchup for him because he'll be able to run the ball and catch the ball. Last week he had a really good PPR performance. I expect him to put it all together this week against the Giants. Bilal Powell versus Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay ranks 30th versus the run. The Jets should win this game, and there's no Forte here to work with, and Powell's looked really impressive when he has been able to get the ball this year. Alfred Morris versus Atlanta. 8 running backs with 13-plus touches have either scored a touchdown or had 80 total yards versus Atlanta this year. Looking good for Alfred Morris. He's going to be the lead guy, the lead back for Dallas without Zeke. I expect him to have a pretty good week this week against Atlanta. Arlen's Darkwa versus San Francisco. The 49ers have allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Darkwa has been really solid, and he's getting a lot of the touches in New York. He's one of the leading guys in terms of yards per carry, and I expect Darkwa to have another nice game here against San Fran. James White versus Denver. James White is actually on pace for 86 catches in 2017, one of the highest of any running back pretty much ever. James White having a really good season catching the football against Denver, a team with good corners, but not very good linebackers to cover tight ends or running backs. Expect New England to attack that, and James White is the guy to go with. Running back sits, Doug Martin versus the Jets. Martin averaged just 3 yards per carry and has just 1 touchdown in his past 4 games. He only had 8 touches versus the Saints. It's not looking good for Doug Martin, especially with Jameis and Mike Evans out. Amir Abdullah versus Cleveland. 2 fumbles last week. I don't know how much Detroit really trusts him anymore, and now he plays the 4th best run defense in the league. It's not looking good for Abdullah. DeMarco Murray versus Cincinnati. Murray has 5 straight games with fewer than 60 rushing yards this season. That's not very good. The Bengals have also given up the least amount of touchdowns to running backs this year. So touchdown-wise and rushing-wise, it's not looking good either way for Murray. Aaron Jones versus Chicago. Ty Montgomery outsnapped him last week. Aaron Jones didn't look too good against Detroit. Every team now without Aaron Rodgers is going to stop the run of Green Bay first, make Brett Hundley beat them down the field, and it's just not looking good for Green Bay's running game at all. Montgomery, Jones, doesn't really matter, and it doesn't help that both these guys are splitting carries. Frank Gore versus Pittsburgh. 6 games in a row with single digits in fantasy points in standard. Now he's playing a pretty solid front 7 in Pittsburgh. This game should be out of hand pretty quickly, making the pass game more relevant than the run game. That means more Marlon Mack, less Frank Gore. My wide receiver starts this week. I have Robert Woods versus Houston. Woods has been the #1 receiver for the LA Rams. He's scored 10 or more fantasy points in each of his last 4 games, and I expect him to do that again against a Houston secondary that's been really bad over the last few weeks. Robbie Anderson versus Tampa Bay. Anderson scored a touchdown in each of his last 3 games. Tampa Bay, one of the worst defenses against the pass. I think Anderson could take advantage once again this week. Juju Smith-Schuster versus Indianapolis. Juju has scored touchdowns in 2 straight. He had that huge game against Detroit, and this week against the Colts, like I said, Vontae Davis out. They don't really have any corners that are outstanding and really scare you, and I think Juju, every week that goes on, is getting more and more involved as we speak. And after this bye week, I mean, they probably implemented some more plays for him in their offense and really installed some plays to work with Juju even more than they already have. So that's good for Smith-Schuster. Sterling Shepard versus the San Francisco 49ers. The opposing #1 receiver versus the 49ers have scored or gained over 100 yards in 6 games in a row. That's a pretty good streak going. Sterling Shepard had a nice week last week with Eli back in the lineup. And Shepard should have another one against San Fran. The Giants have a good chance of winning this game. They are favored, and San Fran's defense is nothing to be scared of for sure. Devin Funchess versus Miami. Miami has allowed a receiver to score in each of its past 4 games. Funchess had a nice game in his first game without Kelvin Benjamin. I expect him to have another nice one against Miami, being the #1 receiver for this team. My wide receiver sits. Speaking of him, I have Kelvin Benjamin versus New Orleans. Marshawn Lattimore for the Saints is actually the highest rated cornerback in Pro Football Focus by Pro Football Focus, and he's shutting down all sorts of #1 receivers. I expect that to happen with Benjamin, who's just getting used to this offensive system in Buffalo. Keenan Allen versus Jacksonville. The Jaguars are the #1 team in the fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing receivers. Allen's going to have to deal with Jalen Ramsey all day, and that's never a good matchup for any receiver. Jordy Nelson versus Chicago. Nelson has 5 catches for 48 yards on 11 targets these past 2 weeks. Not looking good without A-Rod. Brett Hundley can't get him the ball. It's as simple as that. Will Fuller versus LA. The Rams have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing receivers. The first week without Deshaun Watson. Fuller didn't score a touchdown for the first week this season. I don't expect him to do that against the Rams either. Josh Doctson versus Minnesota. Let's put it simply. Doctson only, he had a nice catch last week, whatever. But this week he's playing Xavier Rhodes. So that's all I'm going to say. Tight end starts this week. I have Hunter Henry versus Jacksonville. This is more schematic, not really stats. The only way to move the ball against Jacksonville is not on the sidelines. It's not through your receivers. It's through the middle of the field against their linebackers and safeties with tight ends. So Hunter Henry should have a pretty good game. Charles Clay versus New Orleans. Clay was on fire before he got injured. He's back this week. He has either a touchdown or 100 receiving yards in 3 of his past 4 games. Cam Brate versus the Jets. The Jets are allowing the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends. He did have a couple bad weeks here and there, but I think he's going to bounce back this week. Fitzpatrick going to go early on to Cam Brate to get the rhythm going. Eric Ebron versus Cleveland. Ebron's actually been respectable as of late, and he has a good matchup here. Cleveland has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends and a lot of touchdowns, so I expect Ebron in a game where Stafford should light it up, maybe to get a couple of those. Garrett Selleck versus the Giants. I'd never put Garrett Selleck anywhere near the word start, but this week he's playing the Giants, who have allowed a tight end to score in every single game this season, so if you're desperate, why not? Those are my starts and sits for the 2017 Week 10. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions regarding the stardom or sit-em this week, about the guys that I start or sit this week in my starting sit-em, or if you have any questions about your fantasy lineup in terms of who you should start or sit, let me know in the comments below. Thanks again. It's Mitch of the Bottom Line View. Subscribe, like the video. Peace out.